the flood, before the rise of nations, before the world looked anything like it does now, Scripture records a moment when heaven and earth collided in rebellion. It is one of the most mysterious and controversial passages in the entire Bible. Genesis 6 describes a world spiraling into corruption, not just moral decay, but a hybrid invasion. A crossing of boundaries God never intended to be crossed. A moment when spiritual beings stepped into human history with destructive intent. The result was the Nephilim, giants, warriors of renown, beings whose existence shaped the ancient world and provoked the judgment of the flood. Their presence was not random. It was strategic, calculated, and deeply connected to the war against God's plan. This teaching explores the truth behind that moment. Not myths, not legends. The biblical record, the prophetic implications, the spiritual conflict that still echoes through Scripture. The question is not just where giants came from. The deeper question is why they came, and what their story reveals about the battle for humanity. Before the flood reshaped the world, Scripture records a moment so strange, so disruptive, that it altered the course of human history. Genesis 6 opens a window into a world spiraling into corruption. The question many ask is simple: where did giants come from? But the Bible's answer is anything but simple. The story begins with a phrase that has puzzled scholars for centuries: the sons of God. These were not ordinary men. The Old Testament consistently uses this term for heavenly beings. These beings crossed a boundary God never intended to be crossed. They left their proper domain, stepping into human history with destructive intent. Their rebellion was not random. It was strategic, a direct assault on God's plan for humanity. Genesis 6 says they saw the daughters of men and took them as wives. This was not romance. It was infiltration. The result of this forbidden union was the Nephilim, giants, mighty ones, beings of renown whose presence filled the earth with violence. These giants were not merely tall humans. They were the product of a spiritual rebellion that corrupted the human bloodline. Their existence was so destructive that God declared the entire world had become filled with wickedness. The flood was not just judgment on humanity's sin. It was a divine reset to stop a hybrid corruption from overtaking the earth. But the story doesn't end before the flood. Scripture says, and also after that, giants reappear in the post-flood world. This raises a crucial question: how did they return? The Bible does not describe another heavenly rebellion after the flood. Instead, it shows isolated pockets of giant clans emerging in specific regions. These giants were not global like before. They were localized, contained, limited, and ultimately defeated. The names of these clans appear throughout the Old Testament: Rephaim, Anakim, Emim, Zamzummim. These were not mythological tribes. They were real, physical, and feared by entire nations. When Israel approached the Promised Land, the spies reported seeing giants, descendants of Anak, and described themselves as grasshoppers in comparison. This was not exaggeration. It was terror. The presence of giants in Canaan was not accidental. It was strategic, an attempt to block the land God promised to Abraham. Every giant stronghold sat on territory tied to God's covenant plan. The most famous giant, of course, is Goliath. But he was not alone. Scripture lists multiple giants in his family line. These giants were warriors, trained from youth, and feared across the ancient world. Yet every time giants appear in Scripture, God raises up someone to confront them. This pattern is intentional. Giants represent more than physical enemies. They symbolize spiritual opposition to God's purposes. The battle with giants is always connected to the advancement of God's kingdom. When Israel obeyed, giants fell. When Israel feared, giants prevailed. The story of the Nephilim is not just about ancient history. It is about spiritual warfare, covenant promises, and the faithfulness of God. Giants were never too big for God. They were only too big for unbelief. The Bible never glorifies giants. It exposes them as part of a larger rebellion that God ultimately crushes. Their story is a reminder that no enemy, no matter how intimidating, can stop what God has ordained. But why does Scripture include this strange chapter at all? because it reveals the depth of the spiritual conflict behind human history. The rebellion of the sons of God was an attempt to corrupt humanity, distort God's image, and derail the promise of a coming Redeemer. If humanity's bloodline became corrupted, the Messiah could not come. The flood was not only judgment, it was protection of the promise. After the flood, the enemy tried again through giant clans in Canaan, hoping to block the land where the Messiah's lineage would rise. Every giant stronghold was positioned to choke off the covenant line. But every giant fell, not by human strength, but by God's intervention. The story of giants is ultimately the story of God preserving His promise. The Nephilim were not an accident of nature. They were a strategy of darkness. And God crushed that strategy at every turn. Today, giants take different forms. They are not physical beings towering over cities. They are ideologies, systems, deceptions, and spiritual forces that oppose the knowledge of God. The same enemy who tried to corrupt humanity before the flood now tries to corrupt truth. The same enemy who placed giants in the promised land now places obstacles in the path of faith. But the pattern remains unchanged. God empowers His people to stand, to fight, and to overcome. The ancient giants remind us that spiritual battles are real, but so is God's victory. The Nephilim were terrifying, but they were temporary. God's purposes were eternal. Their story is not about fear. It is about faith. It is about a God who protects His promise, preserves His people, and prevails over every rebellion. And it is about the truth that no giant, ancient or modern, can stand against the plan of God. How big were the giants? When Scripture speaks of giants, it does not describe fantasy creatures or mythic monsters. It describes real, physical beings whose size and strength were so far beyond the norm that entire nations trembled at the sight of them. The clearest measurement comes from Goliath. Depending on the manuscript tradition, he stood somewhere between 6 feet 9 inches and 9 feet 6 inches. Either way, towering over a world where the average man barely reached 5.5 feet. His size alone was enough to paralyze Israel's army. Another data point comes from Og of Bashan. Deuteronomy records the dimensions of his bed, nearly 14 feet long, a royal display piece meant to intimidate. Even if the bed was oversized, Og himself was likely 8 to 10 feet tall, a giant by any standard. The Anakim, Rephaim, and other giant clans described in the Old Testament were known for extraordinary height and strength. The spies in Numbers 13 describe themselves as grasshoppers in comparison, not a literal measurement, but a window into the fear these warriors inspired. These giants were not merely tall, they were trained. They were raised in warrior cultures, bred for battle, and feared for their brutality. Their size was part of a larger strategy of intimidation, a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. Archaeology supports this picture. Ancient Near Eastern warrior elites often stood a foot or more above the average population. Some skeletal remains in the region reach 7 feet, rare, but real, matching the biblical description of unusually large, powerful fighters. The Bible's emphasis is not on exaggeration but on impact. Giants were large enough to terrify armies, strong enough to dominate regions, and imposing enough to make Israel doubt the promises of God. Their size mattered because it created fear. Yet Scripture never glorifies their height. It exposes it. Giants were part of a spiritual strategy, an attempt to block God's purposes, intimidate His people, and occupy territory tied to His covenant plan. Their size was a tool in a larger conflict. And every time giants appear, God raises someone to confront them. Whether through Joshua, Caleb, David, or entire armies, the message is consistent. Giants may be large, but they are not invincible. Their size is impressive, but God's power is decisive. In the end, the question is not how tall the giants were, but how faithful God is. Their height created fear, but His presence created victory. Giants were real, but they were temporary. God's purposes were eternal. Why we don't have giant bones? One of the most common questions about the giants of Scripture is simple. If they were real, where are the bones? The absence of physical remains has fueled speculation, doubt, and sensational theories. But the Bible itself gives a far more grounded explanation. The first reason is the flood. The pre-flood giants, the original Nephilim, lived in a world that was completely destroyed. Their bodies were swept away in a global judgment that reshaped the Earth's surface. Flood geology makes the preservation of identifiable remains nearly impossible. The second reason is warfare. Every major giant clan after the flood, the Anakim, Rephaim, Emim, and others, was defeated in battle. Ancient warfare did not preserve bodies, it destroyed them. Burning, burial in enemy territory, and exposure to the elements ensured rapid decay. The third reason is burial practices. Many ancient cultures intentionally buried their largest warriors in remote highlands, caves, or fortified regions. These sites are difficult to access, heavily eroded, or long lost to time. Bones exposed to moisture, soil acidity, and scavengers do not survive long. 5. The fourth reason is political erasure. Conquering nations often destroyed the remains of defeated giants to erase their memory. This was psychological warfare, a way to declare dominance and remove the fear associated with these warrior elites. The fifth reason is biological. Larger bones decay faster unless preserved in perfect conditions. Massive skeletal structures break down more quickly under weight, moisture, and pressure. Without sealed tombs or dry caves, they simply do not last. Yet archaeology still gives us context. Oversized weapons, massive spearheads, enormous sarcophagi, and fortified structures built for unusually large individuals all point to the existence of giant warrior classes. We lack labeled skeletons, not evidence. Scripture never promises that giant bones would survive. Instead, it emphasizes their destruction. The flood wiped out the first generation. Israel wiped out the second. God ensured that the corruption of the Nephilim would not endure physically. The absence of bones is not a weakness in the biblical record, it is a confirmation of it. The giants were real, but they were temporary. Their bodies were destroyed, their clans were defeated, and their memory was allowed to fade so that God's purposes could advance. In the end, the story of the giants is not about what remains in the ground. It is about what remains in Scripture, a consistent, coherent record of a spiritual conflict that God decisively ended. The giants are gone, but the truth of their existence still stands. Thanks for watching this teaching. If it brought clarity or helped strengthen your walk, take a moment to like, share, and leave a comment. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next message. It helps this reach those who are searching for truth in this hour.